Hello, this is RJ Kwasnikoff again, and this is part 8 of Delzhi in 44 letters. Thank you very much for joining me, and if this is your first video, welcome. And if you haven't, I suggest having looked back at some of the past videos. It's not necessary, these are all more or less standalone, but if I do refer to something I said before, it could help, and it might be a little bit more easier to understand where I'm coming from. So let's go right into the next letter of the Delzhi alphabet, and that is the letter Dzeł, which makes that, it's written in phonetics as DZ, and it's kind of a z, 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 which sounds a bit like a motor or a very logy mosquito. And the shape of Dzeł is what I've been doing here. I've been very enthusiastic about my freshly cleaned inkstone, so I'm writing it over and over again out of joy. I need a little bit more viscosity, so I'll just grind something up really quickly here. And we do have the sound z in American English, even though we don't have a letter for it, and I will talk about examples of that shortly. So let me go over here. I'm going to do it on the left because I ran out of room over here. And it looks like a very triangular, very cool looking letter G. There's a left side, a base, a right side that goes most of the way up, and then a notch towards the middle. And lowercase can either be, because I haven't really decided in my own head what I'd like it to be, just a small version of that, or just the first three lines, the left side, the base, and then the partial right side, depending on how small the print is. And as I mentioned previously, this whole system is evolving in its own right, and not only do my perspectives change, but I'm also really interested to know how other people might influence it or change it in their own way. So, Dzeł comes from the word for a mountain base, and I've written it here, Dzeł. So the word and the letter are the same name. And it's a fairly uncommon word in Dena'ina for mountain. It's kind of an older term. Most Dena'ina dialects use words like degili or degele for mountains, and you'll see those a lot in suffixes and place names. And the reason I like Dzeł is not just that it follows acrophony, which is that idea of a letter looking like or representing a word that starts with that sound. It's attached to things like a mountain pass and moving through a mountain trail and a mountain base that's traversable, and it brings up that idea of mountains symbolizing a challenge and an obstacle and overcoming adversity, and it brings up images of those motivational posters from the 80s of those backcountry skiers, and it's sort of like the more upbeat version of a stop sign, for example, which is like a hard barrier and it's very negative. It's more like, hey, there's a problem and a task at hand, but boy, is it worth it to address it. That the journey is the destination, that kind of a feeling. And the reason why it has this notch in the middle is because it introduces an element of a spiral, and also why this looks like a very Y2K ravey looking letter G. And the spiral implies impermanence and things changing. And I love that juxtaposition because even what we think of as the foundation beneath our feet and things like mountains and stone and the earth, even those things are constantly moving and changing in their own right. Even if it's being done so slowly that we can't perceive them with our own human eyes and even in our own individual lifetimes, it's still happening. They're almost as fluid as the layer of water and the atmosphere of the sky and the wind. Everything is moving in different rates. The atmosphere is moving very quickly, and the ground below us is very slowly, but everything is still moving and changing. So I love mixing those two ideas with the letter Dzeł, because what we think of our foundations still change, and they still are shifting over time. And so to go back to the sound, I've written a few examples here where you can find it in American English, and it's usually in words that end in a D but have an S for like a plural or a possessive. So you're watching this video on YouTube, and on YouTube, many videos run ads, and that's where that sound comes in. I'm recording this a few weeks before Father's Day, and so people are going to be spending time with their dads. And I was just fondly remembering things like Tamagotchis and slap bracelets, and remembering how those were fads. And there's so many other words like lids and duds that have the same thing. It's not just A words. And to go back to mountains literally for a minute, it brings up a really interesting naming convention, because to my extreme north is the mountain of Denali. It's very far away from where my own culture and tribe are, but it borders the Dena'ina speaking region. And Denali, the name itself, is not from Dena'ina. It may have some influence in exchange. There's actually a separate name for it, but I don't remember what it is because it's not one I refer to often at all. But there is another mountain which is not called Dena'ina, Denali, as I spelled here, but rather this one is called Denali, and it has that glottal stop, which begins the Delzhi alphabet. And it's very funny because the definition of Denali is very similar to the literal definition of Denali, which comes from the Atna speaking group to the north, I believe, which is also part of the Nadene extended family of historical, cultural, linguistic groups, however that's classified. That's why there's some similarities. And I'm not sure what the literal definition of Denali is. It is the name of a mountain that is to the northeast of the modern city of Anchorage, which is the largest city in modern Alaska. But it means something like similar, which is like the great one or the big flat one, something like that. But I can't say for sure because I'm not from that area, and I would have to defer to people from cultures in those areas, which are now known as the Eklutna and Chickalun peoples, whose original Dena'ina names were something like Idluget and Nukdinit, which I apologize profusely if I'm saying wrong, or if there's actually different ones that I don't know about that are used instead. I wanted to mention both of their different names because it's more examples of how modern tribes and identities, they're still shifting as much as other people's countries and names shift too. Yeah, just like any other people in the world. So I think that's very interesting, and it shows how naming conventions really depend on context, where you have two words, Denali and Denali, which mean similar things and sound similar, but because one is associated by one language with the tallest mountain in North America, it has a different connotation. It's like larger than life, and it has this majestic symbolism and relationship, whereas the other one is fairly obscure and unknown and not overtly celebrated, at least to my immediate knowledge. And so going back to the idea of shifting foundations, there's also shifting foundations in culture. And when we think of a whole person or a whole group of people, we tend to think that our foundations are set, that we all have a set family tree and a set place and time that we came from and grew up in, and that's that. And while that is true, it also depends on the use of terms and names and labels. And one of the reasons I am so passionate about calling myself and my people Nichił, which is specific to our area, and not Dena'ina, is because even though Dena'ina is our root culture and legacy, it doesn't categorize what we are now and how we are. And in cultural studies and anthropology, there's this idea of thick and thin culture. And I've wrote this little person here, which may or may not be me saying, "You thick," just because I wanted to for fun. And a thick culture is, I'm generalizing, there's a lot more to it, but it is sort of like having a homogenous society, if you think of it that way, where your identity is important. It has a bearing on your position in society and the greater world as a whole. Like if you are in a society where there's two cultures, for example, and maybe one is the dominant culture, you have a thick cultural identity because you obviously stand out and are frequently called the other. And even in a homogenous society, you can still have a thick culture because if there's only one culture that dominates society, then that society will consider how people behave in those norms as thick. So it's a little more complicated, but I'm trying to generalize. And the opposite is thin. So in the United States, when we learn social studies in school growing up, we learn about the idea of the melting pot and having many cultures together. And that's kind of an example of where you might encounter thin cultures, where people have many cultural identities and affiliations, but because they don't change their role in society, they're not thick, they're thin. They're living with people of different cultures, working with people of different cultures. And so that identity and affiliation doesn't really change their position in society and their broader outlook. And as I said, that's a very generalized way of describing thick and thin cultures. There's a little bit more nuance to it. So when it comes to indigeneity, and not just my culture, but many mixed cultures with indigenous roots, people tend to see us as having lost whatever this original is. And for us, it happens to be Dena'ina. And so we are very thinly Dena'ina if you were to just compare us to what the academic or cultural idea of what Dena'ina is. That is a very small part of the whole. It's very thin. It's of no consequence. And very few, if any, people identify as Dena'ina. And the few that I know of that do are connected to other cultures in the Dena'ina-speaking region. So for them, it's kind of a collective term. So instead of being seen as somebody who has lost culture, similar to losing language, as I mentioned previously, I encourage people to think about the whole that they are now. And what makes this whole is all these other parts. We've had this one stripe come in from other cultures, from the South, the Sugpiaq, the Yupik, all the other neighbors that we've had over the generations. And here's the next layer from when European expansion happened. Russians, British, anyone that you could name having a big impact on us. And then the layer of American expansion, which was this hodgepodge of Americans and immigrants from other countries who all kind of came over en masse in the 1800s, or very end of the 1800s. And even today, there's still a lot of cultural mixing happening because many people, although they marry and have children with people outside of the tribe, they still maintain that affiliation. And that affiliation is the cultural grouping that, even though we may not have it named, it's still how we live. And so for me, saying the word Nichił as opposed to Dena'ina is a way to make that whole and to give that concept a name. Yes, we're not all Dena'ina, but we are all Nichił. And when I communicate that to people, it's very eye-opening for them. And they realize, oh, these cultural terms are permanent. And what we thought are these set norms and values are really just labels that we ascribe to different groups of parts of life. And I'm just trying to give a new label to a part of life that we live every day and how we raise our children that, in my opinion, will help them make them feel like they're part of a whole culture when they grow up, as opposed to if you're somebody my age who's grown up feeling like, oh, you're just a part of something and something's missing. And that's my message with what the left-heard Dzeł is. Thank you very much, and I'll see you in the next video.